You know, despite what most people have been taught, Jackie Robinson was not the first black player in Major League Baseball. Blacks had played in the National League in the 1870s and 1880s. There was no American League at the time. But by 1889, they'd been forced out. Likewise, in 1911, the Kentucky Derby eliminated black jockeys after they won 15 of the first 28 derbies. But things got seriously worse in 1915 with the release of D.W. Griffith's film, The Birth of a Nation, which exacerbated a false stereotype and depicting African Americans as unintelligent, brutish, lazy, morally degenerate, and dangerous. Now, this was the exact opposite of what most free black people were trying to do and were doing for themselves. In reality, African Americans enlisted in Union armies, they built their own communities. When white planters abandoned their plantations on the islands off the coast of South Carolina, blacks operated the abandoned plantations themselves. And they made raids into the interior to free slaves on mainland plantations. Now, the myth of African Americans as dangerous and degenerate, or even dependent on others, it began here, and it was further perpetuated and whitewashed, pun intended, in textbook treatments of Reconstruction. And it continues to the present when many Americans of all colors believe, blacks work less than whites, and even though we have census data to show that they work even more. In addition to perpetuating the myth of lazy, helpless black folks, Birth of a Nation presented the Ku Klux Klan as a heroic force that was necessary to preserve American values. And the film's inflammatory nature was a catalyst for gangs of whites to attack blacks and allowed people to justify, their racist attitudes. In short, the masses believed what they saw on screen, which was a highly effective cinematic effort to recast the image of American society to preserve white supremacy and pass off lies and myths about other races as reality. Particularly in the South, white mobs attacked even the richest, most successful African Americans with relative impunity. Upward mobility and wealth creation offered no way out for blacks. Think about that. Accumulating wealth, being successful, only made them more of a target. Furthermore, in the North as well as in the South, African Americans were forced out of skilled occupations, even unskilled jobs, such as postal carriers. So they were forced from sports, they were forced from a lot of jobs. During the Red Summer of 1919, white supremacist terrorism and racial riots took place in more than 36 cities across the United States. The Elaine Massacre also took place during this period. And it happened when black farmers and sharecroppers in Arkansas began to organize to try and negotiate better living and working conditions for themselves, including they were looking for fair accounting and looking for timely payment of what they were owed, from landowners. But when that happened, the black community there paid a very deadly price. And this massacre was by far the deadliest racial confrontation in Arkansas history, and possibly the bloodiest racial conflict in the U.S. up until that point in time, but it would soon be eclipsed. In 1921, the Tulsa Race Massacre, also called the Tulsa Race Riot or the Greenwood Massacre, it took place when mobs of residents attacked black residents and businesses in the Greenwood district in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And that incident has been called the single worst incident of racial violence in American history. The attack was carried out, on the ground and even from the air as people dropped dynamite, from airplanes. Now, these attacks destroyed more than 35 square blocks of the district, which at that time was the wealthiest black community in the United States. It was known as Black Wall Street. Now, that's just two events. I could name a dozen others. There's the New Orleans Massacre of 1866, the Colfax Massacre of 1873, Thibodeau Massacre, 1887, the Atlanta Race Riot, 1906, the Rosewood Massacre, 1923. That's just to name a few. Now, those things were bad enough, but it wasn't just anti-black massacres and riots that were going on. Some communities in the Midwest and in the West became sundown towns, informally threatening African Americans with death if they remained in town overnight. African Americans were excluded from juries throughout the South and in many places in the North, which usually meant, it didn't usually, it always meant that they could forget about legal redress, for even the most obvious wrongs like assault or theft or arson or murder that happened by whites. As Dred Scott had proclaimed back in 1857, a Negro had no rights a white man was bound to respect. Again, the discrimination confronting African Americans was national, not just Southern. The North was segregated as well. Blacks could not buy houses in communities around Minneapolis. They could not work in the construction trades in Philadelphia. They would not be hired as department store clerks in Chicago, and so on and so on and so on. The fact is, African Americans were left with little recourse. Migration to the North, out of the South, which was admittedly bad, but it just led them to segregated urban ghettos. And any type of exodus to form new black communities in the West didn't lead to real freedom. Any attempts at economic improvement, they might have worked temporarily, but they didn't work in the long run because economic gains could not be maintained without their civil and political rights. What they had was just taken from them. And worse still, although racial segregation and discrimination against minorities and minority communities had long predated this policy, the specific practice called redlining, began with the National Housing Act of 1934, which established the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration. The FHA refused to insure mortgages in and near African American neighborhoods, which amounted basically to a state-sponsored system of segregation. At the time of a national housing crisis, the FHA was subsidizing builders who were mass-producing entire subdivisions with the explicit requirement that none of the homes be sold to African Americans. And it's the implementation of this federal policy that aggravated the decay of minority inner city neighborhoods that was caused by the withholding of mortgage capital. And it made it even more difficult for neighborhoods to attract and retain families that might have been able to purchase homes. Now, this had a devastating effect, which has impacted black families for generations. The wealth gap between the races that we have now can be tied to the redlining of black people into low-income neighborhoods that no one would invest in. Blacks were largely denied home ownership, home loans, and they were not allowed, into neighborhoods where property values were able to go up because investment was allowed, because people could invest in it. Now, society's indifference might have been manageable, but the segregation and the physical violence that was aimed at African Americans was overt. It was violent resistance to change. The lingering effects of these policies can be seen in the racial disparities that we still find people in today, that we still find races in today. I can't help but imagine what our country would be like now if African Americans had not been forced out of jobs, if they continued to win Kentucky Derbies, if they continued to deliver mail, to build businesses, been allowed to build businesses and buy houses in whatever neighborhood they could afford. Most middle-class families in this country gained their wealth from the equity that they have in their homes. The enormous difference between the income ratio and wealth ratio of African Americans versus that of white Americans is almost entirely attributable to the federal housing policy that's been implemented throughout much of the 20th century. Much of the wealth that exists in middle-class America was accumulated because grandparents and great-grandparents of people living now had opportunities that were systematically denied to people of color. Now, regardless of what race you are, what is your life like because of these policies? What do you imagine it would be like for someone who's on the other side of the fence? America likes to think of itself as a meritocracy. We want to believe that success and upward mobility depends on our ability to work hard and our ability to hustle. But as these events have pointed out, there are structural inequities that are baked into the system. Prejudices and biases that were institutionalized from Reconstruction that have prevented many from participating or from reaching for the brass ring. And if we don't acknowledge this, then how can we as a nation, how can we move forward? Now, let's be real. There are disparities between the races and in our society today. And there are people who believe that other races are inferior to theirs in one way or another. It's very easy to blame the victim and conclude that people of color are themselves responsible for being on the bottom of society. And yes, we each have a responsibility for what we do and what we achieve in life. But when you look at history, how level has the playing field been? Now, just to be clear, I'm not saying that black people are the only ones who suffered. Many immigrant groups face, varying degrees of harsh discrimination, from the No Irish Need Apply signs in Boston, to the lynching of Italian Americans in New Orleans, to the pogrom against Chinese work camps in California, not to mention how Native Americans were treated from the onset. Studs Terkel was right. Race is our American obsession. To one degree or another, we have all experienced and been subject to unpleasant, disagreeable, hurtful, painful experiences at the hands of others in life. Okay, we've been on the receiving end of people, of family, of organizations, of institutions, that have treated us poorly, unfairly, even hatefully, when they could have chosen not to do so. But we really do still have to ask, how level has the playing field been for people across the board as a whole? Our society, is a reflection of who we are as individuals, and how society treats people is consequently a result of how you respect and treat people. As a thinking person with a brain, I hope that you understand that you have a responsibility to set an example regardless of what side of any fence you find yourself on. The point of Black Lives Matter isn't Black Lives Matter more. It's certainly not only Black Lives Matter. Again, I have to ask, what is your gut reaction when you hear that phrase? And is it a reaction born out of your personal experience, or is your opinion based on the news? The media very largely likes to present the extremes, the crazies, the nutcases, the extremists, as though they represented the mainstream in one way or another. And there are parties in our country that do this to generate fear, to generate distrust, to incite and maintain division, to keep people from positively embracing their differences and uniting through their commonalities. And I don't care where you get your news from, they have an agenda. And if you're not cognizant of it, you can't immunize yourself against it. So I ask again, is your reaction to the Black Lives Matter phrase one of personal experience, or is it just a general feeling or a belief? And do you know why you react the way that you do? And more importantly, do you seek to understand why someone else has the reaction that they do? As a society, we can point to a whole lot of things and say that we've made progress. We used to have black slavery, now we don't. We used to have lynchings, now we don't. Baseball used to be all white, now it isn't. But how much have race relations improved? How do we view one another? Race really is a sharp and a deep division in American life that goes back generations. So, do you believe that racism is over in your corner of the world, in the sphere that you inhabit? Now, as for the question I first asked, since when did Black Lives Matter? That's a question that requires thought, and it immediately begs another question. Matter to who? So to answer that, lastly, before the 1450s, Europeans considered Africans exotic, but not necessarily inferior. It was the Moors from Africa that brought to Spain and Italy much of the learning that led to the Renaissance. Europeans knew that the University of Timbuktu in Northwest Africa, with its renowned library at the time, was a center of cultural learning and scholasticism, where a number of academic subjects were taught. Medicine, surgery, botany, zoology, astronomy, anthropology, cartography, geology, mathematics, physics, chemistry, philosophy, and history. The 15th and 16th centuries are known as the Golden Age of Timbuktu, and they mark that city's emergence as a renowned center of book collecting and manuscript writing, as well as a center for learning and the exchanging of ideas. However, as more and more nations joined the slave trade, slavery became a primary economic engine in the world. Amnesia set in. Europe gradually found it convenient to forget the facts. Europeans came to characterize Africans as mentally inferior, backward, and uncivilized. Although they had known quite a lot about Africa for at least 2,000 years, their powerful imperial impulses led them to purposely forget and purposely to ignore the earlier sources of information and where a lot of this knowledge had come from. So by the 1850s, Africa had long since been recast as the dark continent. Many white Americans, including some Northerners, claimed that black people were so hopelessly inferior that slavery was a proper form of education for them, that somehow it was better for them. It can be argued that black lives haven't mattered to Western civilization at large since sometime after the Renaissance, but you'll have to answer the question for yourself. Have black lives ever mattered to you? The point is this: if we remain ignorant of American history especially, of world history in general, but American history especially, and we lack the understanding of the past, then we have no context to measure the present workings of race in our society. And that's why I've taken this time to identify just a few key moments of our history to give some perspective. If there is one issue before us now that we need to relate to in history, the issue is race relations. So please give it some thought. Don't just settle for and accept things as presented to you in the media. Research some of the events that I've talked about. Think about this. If you're interested, in the description of this video, I've included a link to a PDF document that will point you in the right direction to get more information on some of these subjects or events. There may also be links to an individual perspective or two for you to consider. When you understand, you can help someone else understand. I'm not trying to tell you what to think. I'm not telling you what to think. I'm just asking you to think and then to go start a conversation. Thank you so much for watching.